Hello everyone, welcome to Viking. This is the video version of a presentation that I did this previous weekend at a conference for Neo-Pagans called From Axe to Hammer, an Archaeologist's History of Thor's Hammer. I did this presentation because, with the exception of a paper done by historian and scholar of religion Hilda Roderick Ellis Davidson in 1964. No scholars have really taken the time to look at a broad history of the development of Thor's hammer in the archaeological record. So I made this presentation to remedy that. And in this presentation, I argue that Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, may have originally been an axe rather than a hammer, or at least may have been multiple weapons at once. So with that, we're going to get into the presentation. Now, of course, I'm sure many of us are well aware of Thor from a variety of popular media, whether it be comic books and comic book related movies like Marvel Comics Thor, or whether it be from uh, various other media like anime such as High School DxD. However, these images of Thor in those media are often the farthest from what mythology depicts and describes Thor as it can be. Now, this does not mean they can't be entertaining and they aren't valuable in their own right as modern versions of the mythology, but they are still oftentimes very different from how Thor is described in mythology. Uh, Whereas Marvel's Thor, for example, is oftentimes depicted as blonde. Um, the mythology version of Thor uh, is described as an individual who is red haired and red bearded and often very, very muscle bound. And both very similar to and also very different from Marvel Comics lore. He is described and depicted as somebody who is very, very cunning. Oftentimes, there is a misconception amongst people due to, in part, Marvel Comics, even though in Marvel Comics, Thor oftentimes is very cunning in himself, but also due to the way he is described by admittedly many scholars, that he is not, quote unquote, not the brightest god or the brightest light bulb on the tree, which is the farthest from the truth. He is actually very cunning. He may not be as cunning as his father, Odin or Woden, but I mean, let me put it this way: how many of us are very smart and can hold an intellectual conversation, uh, but are not, say, experts in, astrophysics, like uh, whether it be Neil deGrasse Tyson or Michio Kaku. So just because he's not as cunning as his father doesn't mean he's as cunning. And of course, the most emblematic symbol of Thor in both media and mythology is his hammer, Mjolnir, that he uses to slay Etons or Jotuns and trolls. However, there, as I said at the beginning, there is quite a lot of evidence that, at least in part, Mjolnir may have been an axe rather than a hammer for at least part of its history. Which leads us to our first section. Now, I'm going to ask the viewers to bear with me for just a couple of minutes um, in this first section because it does not necessarily hold any value towards mythology, but it does sort of set up the background and the history of the development of axes in Scandinavia. So, Axes begin to appear in Scandinavia in the Mesolithic era, which lasted roughly from 7,000 to 5,000 BCE, uh, being associated with the Ertubola culture, as well as one could argue, depending on how broad one makes Scandinavia, uh, Finland, and other Baltic areas, such as Lithuania and Estonia, with the comb ceramic culture. Though, for the purposes of this section, we are focusing on the Ertubola culture. So, axes first began to appear in the Mesolithic era somewhere around the 7,000, 7,500 BCE mark. And we have quite a lot of evidence of this, with examples being cited in papers such as this by Mikhail A. Manian et al., titled First Encounters in the North, Cultural Diversity and Gene Flow in Mesolithic Scandinavia. And in this paper, the authors talk about the discovery and examination of chert axes that were both made via chipping. Sorry, those are flakes. They describe flakes, but also some ground stone celt axes. But also they did describe axes made by a chipping of chert. And here's another paper that also talks about the exact same thing. And again, here's an example of those axes made via chipping chert right here. And some more examples over here. And as you can see, these axes have a very wide range culturally throughout the Mesolithic era, of course, well into the early Neolithic era, as this graph here shows. Which brings us to the first section where we examine the religious aspects of axes in Scandinavian culture, the Nordic Neolithic era, which lasted from roughly 5,000 to 2,000 BCE, and is associated with the development of the funnel beaker culture as well as the Ertubola culture that was still extant at the time. And during the Neolithic era, we begin to see some ritual associations, some possible religious associations with axes, as described in this paper by Lars Larsen titled Water and Fire Transformation Elements in Ritual Deposits of the Scandinavian Neolithic. And in this paper, Larsen examined several sites throughout Scandinavia, specifically Denmark and Sweden, as you see here, where he discovered that there were large amounts and a large distribution of ritual axe deposits in wetlands throughout Scandinavia that seem to have been placed there deliberately throughout these wetlands in Neolithic Scandinavia. And the axes sort of looked a variety of different ways. There were some that were described as quote-unquote battle axes, like you see this here, and then of course some of them being the chipped chert or flint axes. And what they found is these axes show traces of intentional burning they show evidence of heat, to be more specific, suggesting intentional burning of these axes, as well as they show evidence of intentional breaking, i.e. ritual breaking. So what this suggests is that Neolithic communities in Scandinavia were intentionally burning and destroying axes and then depositing them in ritual sites throughout wetland ritual sites throughout Scandinavia, which in turn suggests some form of religion or religious practice, or at least some ceremonial practice, already beginning to be developed around uh, 7,000 years ago in Scandinavia. Now, of course, there's no way to prove that there's a connection between these rituals and the worship of Thor, but it does show that already beginning around 7,000 years ago, um, 6 to 7,000 years ago, that axes were starting to be connected to um, some form of religion and religious practices. Which brings us to our next section, the Nordic Bronze Age, which lasted roughly from 2000 to 500 BCE. Some dates put the start of the Nordic Bronze Age around 1600 BCE. And this is where cultures, cultures and cultural deposits in Scandinavia really, and in Europe as a whole, really begin to see a massive change. And this is connected with a group in Central Asia, in Central Eurasia, the Eurasian steppe, specifically known as the Yamnaya, who are connected with the Indo-European expansions, which lasted from roughly 3000 to 1000 BCE. And these Indo-European Yamnaya warriors, peoples, not just warriors, were a horse culture connected with horse riding warriors, as well as individuals who used chariots and carts pulled by horses. And this is because the Yamnaya, as well as slightly a slightly related but not quite the same culture of the Botai, both of these cultures domesticated horses around 5 to 6,000 years ago, and then eventually, using the horse, developed horse riding, as well as technologies such as carts and chariots. In fact, this is the region that most archaeologists think the wheel was invented in. And shortly after making these domestications, and by shortly I mean it was still several hundred to maybe 1,000 years, but shortly in the context of time and the history of humanity, these Yamnaya horse peoples began to spread out of their Central Eurasian steppe homelands throughout much of the rest of Eurasia, including eventually Scandinavia. And we can tell this via a lot of genetic data that has been produced via archaeology and ethnography and various other things like that, showing that there is indeed a large degree of Central Eurasian DNA in Scandinavians, starting in the Nordic Bronze Age. And once these Yamnaya horse lords, as we'll call them, migrated out of the Central Eurasian steppe into Europe and Scandinavia, we begin to see the development of new cultures, such as the corded ware culture and the bell beaker cultures, as well as the Proto-Anatolian cultures, etc., that would eventually evolve into other offshoot cultures, such as the battle axe and sea axe cultures in Scandinavia. Here's just another map, another couple of maps sort of showing that dynamic. And once the Yamnaya migrate into Scandinavia and begin to intermarry and assimilate and sometimes conquer cultures in Europe, this is when we begin to see in Scandinavian rock art things like chariots and such, as I talked about in my video on my channel about the sun wheels and whether or not they were indeed sun wheels, and I will link that in the iCard. But we also begin to see uh, the depictions of warrior figures wielding battle axes, as seen in these pictures here, which goes back to the reason there are those two cultures in Scandinavia in the Bronze Age and late Neolithic era are called the battle axe and sea axe cultures. That's because axes start to become really, really, really prominent in the rock art and archaeological record of Scandinavia. And what makes this, where this brings us back to religion and connects it with Thor, is we also begin to see the carving of individuals who are um, very clearly not human, who wield axes in the rock art as well. Specifically, this picture rock art here is like really difficult to make any information out of, because it's very clearly not a human figure. Um, Now it could be depicting, like, for example, a sort of medicine man shaman like figure, and I know those are loaded terms. Um, but they're the best way to describe it at the moment. But some sort of religious figure, perhaps. But it also is equally as likely that this is some form of deity or spirit that is beginning to be developed and incorporated into the religion. And of course, it's shown wielding an axe or an axe like object. So it's not a huge leap to assume that this is an early depiction of Thor. It's also not a huge leap to assume it's just a depiction of, again, a religious figure. Um, but that doesn't change that it's possibly an early depiction of Thor. Another good example of this sort of phenomenon is this rock art here, where you see this individual who is more humanoid in shape than this, but is very clearly taller, larger than these two twin figures here, who is wielding an axe over them. Excuse me, an axe over them. Uh, Now, this doesn't necessarily mean it is Thor, but it is usually when an individual is depicted in any um, fashion as being larger than normal humans usually are, uh, they are usually meant to mean that they are deities. For example, in uh, ancient Greek iconography and mythology, heroes are often described as being much larger than humans. Um, Hercules, Achilles, etc., were oftentimes described as being, not like 40 feet tall, but 7, 10, etc. feet tall, and being somehow connected to the divine. So that means, taking that in mind, that's not a huge leap to assume that this is what's happening here. Furthermore, the act of holding an axe over a pair of individuals who are very clearly or very likely uh, kissing in some form of perhaps a marriage um, harkens back to a very well-known tradition in Scandinavia during the Iron Age and the Viking Age, of when individuals get married, you place a hammer on either the lap of the wife, or you wave a hammer over the couple in order for Thor to uh, sort of commemorate and protect this marriage. So, very interesting implications via this rock art. We also begin to see the development of bronze axes that, as you can see here by these backsides, do sort of look like hammers in a way. And these axes are both, of course, used for warfare, but also have been connected to some sort of ornamentation, as seen in this paper by Lars Larson titled a miniature in amber of a battle axe from the battle axe culture. And here's a depiction of the miniature he's talking about. And in it, he describes how evidence suggests that this miniature battle axe was worn as some form of ornamentation on clothing, possibly an early form of, say, wearing a Mjolnir pendant here. Now, doesn't necessarily prove it, but it's interesting to see that they're already beginning to make miniatures of weapons such as battle axes to wear as ornamentation. Furthermore, the wearing of the battle axe on clothing has some connotations with later confirmed versions of Thor's hammer. Which brings us to the next section, the late Roman Republic and Roman Empire period. And yes, I do realize that I left the E out of the late. And this is the most important source, or the most well-known source, about Germanic religion from this time period is the very famous Tacitus, who described the religion of the Germanic peoples, including peoples of Scandinavia, in his aptly named manuscript Germania. And in it, he describes the Germanic worship of the deity of Hercules, because in in Roman religion, Hercules, while having been a demigod hero in life, was deified in death. And Tacitus describes how Hercules is essentially the god that they sing to when they go into battle, and that he, at one point in time, walked among them. And he describes how important Hercules is and how connected he is to, for example, slaying monsters and things like that. And this connects. So before I get into this, it is important to note that Tacitus was most definitely probably not talking about the Greco-Roman Hercules. He was probably describing a pre-existing Germanic deity with a name of a deity that he already knew. So they were described as being very similar. So Tacitus was like, oh, so this is like Hercules. So he was syncretizing it. This does not mean that the Greco-Roman religion existed in what is now modern day Germany and Scandinavia. It just means that that Tacitus saw a very similar deity and connected the dots. Anyways, so this connection with Hercules and Thor via Tacitus is made further stronger by the development of a cult to Hercules in Germany, Germania, where Hercules is dubbed Hercules Magasenus. And one of the key characteristics of Hercules and Hercules Magasenus, which is the Germanic version of Hercules, is the club, which he used to slay monsters. And this cult began to pop up throughout the borderlands of Rome and Germany, the Romano-German borderlands. And it was often associated with essentially a warrior cult, were sort of like berserkers, which I talked about in my berserkers video that I will link in the iCard as well, where individuals would go through sort of a rite of initiation in order to enter it, and it was often associated with soldiers and warriors. But where I want to bring it back to the connection with Thor and Mjolnir pendants is that we via archaeology throughout the Romano-German borderlands, large numbers of what are known as Hercules or Donner's clubs Donner being the early name for Thor in Germany, were found. And also were found in Anglo-Saxon context, in contexts in England connected to the Anglo-Saxon migration. So from around 410 CE-ish onwards. And they found quite a lot of these Hercules club pendants in those areas. And what is interesting to me and brings back some connection to the Nordic Bronze Age is that much like the miniature amber axe heads, these Hercules clubs were often attached to garments and were worn as ornamentation on garments. And we do know that in Roman contexts, soldiers who worshipped the cult of Hercules would wear Hercules' club for protection. So it's very possible that this was, and very likely that this was done as well with Germanic peoples and the Hercules Magus cult. Um, so And of course, again, this does not mean that this was the Greco-Roman Hercules. It was probably the Germanic deity that was being called Hercules, but was in fact Thor. This is really not up for debate among scholars. It's pretty, pretty much agreed upon. But like I said, what I think is very interesting is that this seems to be a continuation of a practice that was already begun in the Nordic Bronze Age. Now we're going to move on into the next section, the early and high medieval period, roughly 475 to 1100 CE. And there's again some debate on that starting and ending period. So in the early medieval period, we begin to see the appearance of objects in mainly in Anglo-Saxon England, but also on the continent as well. Objects known as the Kentish hammer, named aptly after the area of Kent in England. And they are often described as long-handled hammer pendants like you see here. Some of them were worn by themselves, some of them and some of them were made from bronze. A lot of them were actually seem to have been found on sort of keychain-like objects together, so like multiple versions of them. And of course, it's very probable that these were oftentimes worn on garments rather than around the neck, though, of course, some like these were worn around the neck. We also begin to see the appearance of these very obvious pendants that were in the shape of axe heads. In fact, these axe head pendants are actually a little bit earlier. These are the ones that sort of began in the 400 CE period, with these showing up later, which actually brings me to my question, to my next question. Should we say that these are hammers, or does the fact that these Kentish hammers, so-called Kentish hammers, have a longer handle and a rather axe-like looking shape, do we say that they are hammers, or should we in fact be saying that they are axes? And where we can see a good piece of evidence for the idea that perhaps these were axes. I mean, these are obviously axes, but perhaps these Kentish hammers were axes as well, is in a Anglo-Saxon manuscript that was written around 1000 CE-ish, where called the Dialogue of Solomon and Saturn. And in it, it describes a scene that I will quote here that says, the Pater Noster will shout the devil with boiling shafts, and the lightning will burn him and mark him, and the rain will shed over him, and the thick darkness confuse him, and thunder thrash him with a fiery axe. So this is obviously a description of, I mean, thunder using a fiery axe. This is an obvious description of Thor. Again, much like the Hercules clubs, this is not really up for debate among scholars. This is a very clear depiction of Thor in a Christian context. But what this description does bring into question is to whether or not Thor originally used a hammer, or rather used an axe. However, as we go into our next section, it's important to note the water does begin to muddy a little bit, because during the Viking Age, roughly 787 CE to 1100 CE, we begin to see more connection with hammers. We see this connection between Thor and hammers in rune stones and rock art, like here. We see it connected to Thor connected to hammers and figurines and metalwork. And of course, we begin to see the appearance of a lot of hammer pendants like these and these. Though it is important to note, as many archaeologists, such as Dr. Howard Williams of the University of Sheffield have pointed out, these were not always originally seen as hammers. In the early archaeological research from the late 1800s and early 1900s, like the 1920s and such, these were actually described as anchors. But however, when several examples of hammers that had runes that said that, this is a hammer, and with a recent example being only found a couple of years ago, archaeologists began to shift that view and began to say that no, these are indeed hammers. However, it's also important to note that many of these hammers were found in contexts of blacksmiths. So it's still up for debate as to whether or not these are always depictions of Mjolnir. But though, and we also, before I move on to what I was about to say, we also find during this time period a connection with some definite connections with Thor and with Mjolnir pendants being worn, at least in some relation to crucifixes, as seen in these molds here, where crucifixes and hammer pendants were made together. So we do know that Mjolnir pendants were beginning to be worn as sort of a reaction to more common wearing of crucifixes in Scandinavia, with some examples actually being sort of a combination of both. This is called a wolf cross, and as you can see, it is very hammer-like, as well as having the crucifix in it, and it would actually be worn sort of upside down, as you can see here, rather than a crucifix being worn top up. So as I was about to talk about before I got sidetracked, we do actually have some connections, some written connections to Thor and the use of hammers, as seen in rune tablets, such as the Kevenby amulet that was made somewhere in the thousands CE, and it was made as a way to protect people from disease and things like that, specifically one individual. And in it, it states very clearly, "May Thor protect him with his hammer, which came out of the sea." So it is very clear that while we're not sure that all of the Mjolnir pendants were necessarily associated with Thor, or were just associated with blacksmithing, and maybe perhaps dwarves and elves who were also associated with blacksmithing, while we're not completely sure of that, and those are very valid criticisms, we do have some very definite connections with Thor and hammers in Scandinavia, thanks to things like the Kittenby amulet. And here's the Kittenby amulet here. That being said, the water's muddy. The water is muddied even more as medieval scholars in Scandinavia, such as Saxo Grammaticus, describe in their sources, such as Saxo Grammaticus's Gesta Danorum, specifically Book 3. Saxo Grammaticus describes Thor as fighting with either a mace or a club. But that being said, the water gets muddied even more as later on in the Gesta Danorum Book 13, which is not available for, it's available for public purchase, but it's very expensive and comes in Latin. But it is cited and has been translated by scholars such as Hilda Roderick Ellis Davison in her paper that I alluded to at the beginning of the video, titled Thor's Hammer. She cites how the Gesta Danorum Book 13 talks about how in a raid between rival Scandinavian kings in 1125 CE, the Danish king Magnus Nilsson took away from Thor's temple hammers that were used to bang against anvils and possibly drums to imitate a smith's toil, as well as to imitate the sounds of thunder to scare away evil spirits and things like that. So what we have here is a scholar who is contradicting himself within his own works. And in one of his earlier volumes, Gesta Danorum Book 3, he says Thor wields a club or a mace, but in a later volume, Gesta Danorum Book 13, he claims that Thor is associated with hammers. Now, I have heard some very valid counter arguments to this statement that I'm making now, that perhaps this was a mistake in translation, whether it be the mistake in translation from Book 3 that I just showed you, or whether it be a mistake in translation for Book 13. However, unless somebody goes back and retranslates these manuscripts to double check, which to my knowledge somebody has not done in a while, we have to assume that it is a contradiction on Saxo Grammaticus's part. Now we're going to move on to a very interesting aspect in the connection of axes with Thor, and that is the use of the so-called Thunderstones in European folk magic from the beginning of the medieval period, 475 CE, to the present. So Thunderstones are these Neolithic and early Bronze Age axes that have been found in early and late medieval and early modern Northern European, including Scandinavian contexts, such as this example here that was found in a woman's female burial at Sjögren or King's Hill, Alvensnäs, I believe, Sweden. Somebody from Scandinavia, please correct me if I'm wrong. And many archaeologists have connected this thunderstone with the idea that the stone axe was placed there to protect this woman from evil forces. And that's because thunderstones throughout Scandinavia in the medieval and early modern period were connected with Thor and with thunder, and were used as described in this paper by Tomas Karasinski, titled Against Disease, Suffering, and Other Plagues, the magic healing role of thunderstones in the Middle Ages and modern times. they were used as a sort of a form of uh, folk magic uh, in medieval Scandinavia via runes, and here in Sweden and things like this. And archaeologists and people of the Middle Ages associated their protective properties and their thunderstoneness with Thor. However, it's also important to note these are not always necessarily connected with Thor, as seen in this example that was seems to have been just simply made to fit onto a bag by somebody as part of some sort of ceremonial dress. But we also see other versions of thunderstones that are even more associated with Thor, as described in this uh, paper titled Ring Out Your Dead, Distribution, Form, and Function of Iron Amulets in the Late Iron Age Grave Fields of Louisville um, by Megan Pauls Matson McGinnis. And in it, she describes several amulets that have fossil echinoids as well as iron and other precious metals that were worn as pendants to protect from thunder and evil. As you can see, lightning protection amulets. And in it, she suggests that the way the echinoids, uh, see here it was, how does she put this? Yes, the strangeness of their shapes being attributed to the divine origin of the skies, um, and suggest that may have some connection to Thor, and that is obviously not a huge leap. And the fact that they were used as a way to protect from lightning does sort of back this up. Now, of course, there's no way to really prove this, but there does seem to be a connection between Thor and Thunderstones and lightning protection amulets like this that would suggest that Thor is indeed connected religiously to these objects. And though it is also important to note that they were not always used necessarily for protection, because as I alluded to earlier, they were used in some forms of folk magic. As you can see here, these are thunderstones that are, Neolithic and late Bronze Age axes, early Bronze Age axes, not late, that show how their edges are missing, and that's because people in the late Middle Ages and early modern era would file off the powder of these Neolithic and early Bronze Age axes to use the powder for medicinal purposes. And you can see this being a pretty widespread practice, as even families of pharmacists like the Link family from Leipzig, had like large numbers of thunderstones they would use for medicinal purposes. Though again, pretty far on into Scandinavian, into modern Scandinavia, the 16, 17, and 1800s, thunderstones were connected with thunder and Thor, as seen in this manuscript by the Swedish pastor and chronicler J.P. Clint, where he talks about thunderstones and stone objects falling during a storm. Now we move on to the last section of the video, Thor and Thor's hammer in the modern world, 1800 CE to present. So starting in the 1800s, of course, by this point in time, Scandinavia is Christian, no longer pagan, and has been Christian for around 1,000 years, give or take. But we do see some holdovers of Thor that, while they are not necessarily hammers, they are still sort of connected to the hammer. The first source we're going to look at is Teutonic Mythology by Jakob Grimm, which is a problematic source when you're trying to reconstruct Germanic and Norse paganism as it was in the medieval period and further back. But in terms of early modern Scandinavian views, it is a very good source. And in this source, on page 176, on page 176, Jakob Grimm talks about how people throughout Scandinavia and Scandinavian adjacent countries like Estonia and Finland, they associate thunder as some sort of divine thing, even then, or at least some sort of folklore divine thing, calling it like saying things like "dear thunder," or "holy thunder," etc., etc. So suggesting that thunder still holds some deep spiritual connection. And oftentimes in Germanic and Norse mythology, thunder was associated specifically with Mjolnir. We also see this sort of continuation in the early modern and modern Scandinavian folklore or revolving around trolls, where folklorists, Scandinavian folklorists such as Benjamin Thorpe and his work Northern Mythology, comprising the principal popular tradition and superstitions of Scandinavia, North Germany, and the Netherlands. In it, he describes how trolls are scared away by lightning, which even he states is Thor, the god of thunder, was the deadly foe of the trolls, and talks about the dread entertained by the trolls for thunder dates from the time of paganism, Thor, the god of thunder, being the deadly foe of their race. So while Thor had moved away and become quote unquote myth to Scandinavian peoples, the idea that thunder and lightning scares away monsters like trolls still persisted. And again, thunder and lightning in mythology connected to Thor was specifically attributed to Thor's weapon, hammer, axe, what have you, Mjolnir. And then, of course, in the modern era as it is today, we see a variety of different ways you can find Mjolnir, whether it be tattoos or pendants, whether they be on depictions on plates or on coffee mugs. Mjolnir is arguably the most arguably the image that is most associated with the modern Neo-Pagan religions, with the possible exception of the Triketra. Okay, so with that, that ends our video on the history of Thor's hammer in archaeology and the historical texts. I hope you all enjoyed this video. Sources will be in the description and in the comments. If you want to see me cover any of these other subjects in a later video in greater detail, please feel free to leave a comment in the comment section, and remember to like, share, and subscribe.